Let me tell you something most women learn too late. The moment you stop talking to him, everything changes, but not always the way you think. You sit there overthinking, checking your phone, replaying every conversation like it meant more than it did. That emotional attachment will have you lowering your standards just to feel chosen. And while you're trying to protect the connection, you end up losing yourself. See, discipline isn't just about money or success. It's about how you manage your emotions when love gets uncomfortable. A man will read your silence very differently than you expect. Sometimes he feels relief, sometimes curiosity, and sometimes nothing at all. And that truth right there is what hurts the most, because you thought your absence would make him realize your worth. But if you never valued yourself, he won't either. You cannot expect someone to respect boundaries you don't enforce. When you finally go silent, it shouldn't be a strategy. It should be a standard. Because a woman who knows her value doesn't disappear to be noticed. She steps back because she refuses to be disrespected. And that shift changes how he thinks, moves, and whether he deserves access. The moment you stop talking, you finally give the situation room to tell the truth. See, when you're constantly reaching out, checking in, fixing the energy, carrying the conversation, you're not observing reality, you're controlling it. And a lot of women don't even realize they're doing that. You think you're putting in effort, but what you're really doing is covering up his lack of it. You're filling the silence he should be stepping into. So of course it feels like there's something there because you're the one creating it. But when you go quiet, now there's space, and space don't lie. A man who is genuinely interested doesn't sit comfortably in your absence. He notices it, not because you disappeared like a game, but because your presence had real value to him. He reaches out, he checks in, he makes sure the connection doesn't fade. That's not confusion, that's clarity. Effort is always clear when someone cares. Now, here's the part most women struggle with. You don't like what the silence shows you, because sometimes when you step back, he doesn't step forward. And that hits your ego, your emotions, your expectations. Now you're sitting there asking yourself, did I mean anything? Let me answer that straight. If a man can go on comfortably without hearing from you, you were not a priority in his life. You were an option, a convenience, or simply a moment of attention when it suited him. That's not harsh, that's honest. And see, the problem isn't just his behavior. The problem is how long you were willing to ignore it before the silence exposed it. You saw the delayed replies. You noticed the inconsistency. You felt the shift in energy. But because you were emotionally attached, you kept giving him chances he didn't earn. You kept explaining things that didn't need explaining. You kept showing up hoping he would eventually match your level. That's where discipline was missing. Because discipline in relationships means this: you don't keep investing where there's no return. Now when you finally stop talking, it's not just about him anymore. It's about you facing the truth you were avoiding. His silence is not confusing. It's actually very clear. What confuses you is the story you told yourself while ignoring the reality. You believe potential over pattern. You trusted words over actions. And now, without your effort holding things together, everything falls exactly where it was always heading, right there. That's where your power begins if you choose to use it. Because silence is not a tool to make him come back. That's where a lot of women get it wrong. You think if I stop talking, he'll realize my worth. No. A man who needs your absence to realize your value is already telling you you're not a priority. Silence is not about manipulating him. It's about revealing him. And once he's revealed, you have a decision to make. Do you go back and start talking again just to feel connected? Or do you accept what his actions showed you and move accordingly? See, a high-value woman doesn't argue with evidence. She doesn't chase clarity when behavior already gave her the answer. She doesn't break her own boundaries just because she misses someone. Missing someone is normal. Lowering your standards because of it, that's where the damage happens. And let's talk about self-respect for a second. Because every time you reach out to someone who clearly isn't meeting you halfway, you're telling yourself, I'm okay with less. You might not say it out loud, but your actions speak loud enough. And over time, that builds a pattern, not just in this relationship, but in how you show up in every connection. So when you go silent, it's not about waiting for him. It's about watching him. You're observing, you're learning. You're seeing whether his actions align with what you need. And if they don't, your silence becomes permanent. Not emotional, not dramatic, just intentional. Because here's the truth. Effort is never confusing. When a man wants to talk to you, he talks. When he values you, he shows it. When he sees a future, he invests in it. There is no guessing, no decoding, no overthinking. All that confusion you feel, that comes from inconsistency. And inconsistency is a decision. So stop translating mixed signals into hope. If he reaches out when you go silent, pay attention to how. Is it consistent or temporary? Is it meaningful or just enough to keep you around? Because some men don't come back because they value you. They come back because they miss access to you. And if you don't have standards, you'll confuse attention with intention every time. That's why silence is powerful. Not because it changes him, but because it reveals him. And more importantly, it forces you to confront yourself. It shows you where you were overgiving. It shows you where you ignored red flags. It shows you where your emotions overruled your standards. And once you see that clearly, you have the opportunity to correct it. Because at the end of the day, the goal isn't to make him realize your worth. The goal is for you to realize it so deeply that you don't stay anywhere it's not recognized without effort. Let's get real about something most people don't want to admit. Emotional attachment will have you doing things completely out of character. You start off strong, clear about what you want, firm on your standards. But the moment you get emotionally invested, everything begins to shift. You start making exceptions. You start justifying behavior you used to say you'd never tolerate. And before you know it, you're accepting the bare minimum from someone you once expected consistency from. That's not love. That's attachment controlling your judgment. See, attachment isn't always about the other person. It's about how you feel when you're around them, how they make you feel when things are good, and how badly you want to get that feeling back when things go wrong. And that right there is where standards begin to fall. Because now you're not making decisions based on reality. You're making decisions based on emotion. You're no longer asking, is this right for me? You're asking, how can I keep this feeling? And those are two completely different mindsets. When a woman gets emotionally attached too quickly, she starts investing before she has enough information. You're building expectations on potential instead of pattern. He showed you a little attention, maybe some charm, maybe a few good conversations, and now in your mind, he's more than what he's actually proven to be. You fill in the gaps with hope. You create a version of him that matches what you want, not what he consistently shows. That's dangerous, because now when he disappoints you, you don't respond with clarity. You respond with confusion. You start asking questions like, why is he acting like this? Instead of asking, why am I accepting this? You start analyzing his behavior instead of correcting your boundaries. And every time you do that, you move further away from your standards. Let me tell you something straight. Your standards don't disappear overnight. They erode slowly, one excuse at a time. First, it's he's just busy. Then it's maybe he's going through something. Then it becomes, I don't want to lose him over something small. And just like that, what used to be unacceptable becomes something you tolerate regularly. Now, here's the part that really matters. When you lower your standards because of emotional attachment, you're not just affecting this situation. You're training yourself to accept less. You're building a habit of compromising your value for temporary emotional comfort. And once that becomes a pattern, it doesn't stop with one person. It follows you into the next relationship and the next one after that. That's how cycles get created. Because now it's not about him anymore, it's about how you show up. You start overgiving, you start proving. You start trying to earn something that should have been given freely. Respect effort, consistency. And the more you give without receiving, the more unbalanced the situation becomes. But instead of stepping back, you lean in harder. Because attachment makes you believe that if you just do a little more, things will change. But here's the truth. Effort doesn't fix inconsistency. It exposes it. If someone is already giving you the bare minimum, your extra effort won't inspire them to rise. It will make them comfortable staying exactly where they are. Why would they do more when they're already getting everything with less? And that's where emotional discipline comes in. You have to learn how to separate what you feel from what you accept. Just because you like someone doesn't mean they meet your standards. Just because you have a connection doesn't mean it's a healthy one. Just because you're attached doesn't mean you should stay. Feelings are real, but they are not always right. A disciplined woman understands that emotions are temporary, but standards are permanent. She doesn't let a moment of connection override a pattern of disrespect. She doesn't allow chemistry to blind her to inconsistency. She takes a step back and evaluates not just how she feels, but how she's being treated. Because at the end of the day, how someone treats you is more important than how they make you feel. Anyone can make you feel good in moments, but consistency, that requires intention. And if you're constantly feeling confused, anxious, or unsure, that's not connection, that's instability. And instability is not something you build a healthy relationship on. Now let's talk about accountability. It's easy to point fingers and say, he changed. But a lot of times the signs were there from the beginning. The inconsistency didn't start later. You just ignored it earlier. Because at that time, your emotions were louder than your standards. That's why awareness is so important. You have to be honest with yourself about what you're accepting and why. Are you staying because it's right or because you're attached? Are you tolerating behavior because it aligns with your standards or because you're afraid to let go? Those are hard questions, but they're necessary because growth doesn't come from comfort. It comes from truth. And the truth is, attachment will always try to convince you to stay where you're not valued. It will tell you to be patient when you should be setting boundaries. It will tell you to understand when you should be walking away. It will make you feel like leaving is a loss, even when staying is costing you your self-respect. That's why you need discipline. Discipline to pause before reacting. Discipline to observe instead of assuming. Discipline to walk away when your standards are not being met even when it hurts, because real power is not in holding on. It's in knowing when to let go. And once you master that, your standards stop being flexible based on how you feel. They become a foundation, something solid, something non-negotiable. And when that happens, you don't just protect your heart, you elevate your entire life. Let's talk about something a lot of women misunderstand, and it costs them respect in relationships every single day. Men don't value what's always available the same way they value what they can lose. That's not about games, it's about human nature. When something feels guaranteed, when access to you feels constant, no matter how he shows up, the urgency disappears. And when urgency disappears, effort usually follows. You can be kind, loyal, supportive, and emotionally available, but if there are no boundaries attached to that, it turns into something else. It turns into predictability without value. You become someone he knows will always be there, no matter how inconsistent he is. And once that belief sets in, he adjusts his behavior accordingly. Not because he's necessarily a bad man, but because people respond to what is required of them, and if nothing is required, nothing extra is given. Now understand this clearly. Respect is not built on how much you give. It's built on how much is required to keep you. That's the part many women miss. You think giving more will make him appreciate you more, but in reality, it often makes him comfortable doing less. Because from his perspective, he's already getting the benefits without having to rise to your level. There's no pressure to improve, no reason to step up, because the situation already works in his favor. And here's where it gets deeper. When you don't create the possibility of loss, you remove the reason for him to protect the connection. If he believes you'll always forgive, always understand, always come back, then there's no consequence tied to his actions. And without consequences, behavior rarely changes. You end up in a cycle where you keep hoping for better while he keeps operating at the same level because nothing is forcing him to do otherwise. This is not about threatening to leave or playing emotional games. It's about having standards that are real, not just spoken. Because a boundary that isn't enforced is not a boundary, it's a suggestion. And people don't respect suggestions the way they respect standards. A man respects what he has to work to keep. That doesn't mean making things difficult for no reason. It means being clear about what you accept and what you don't, and being willing to walk away when those standards are not met. That's where the power is. Not in saying, you better treat me right, but in showing through your actions that you will remove yourself from anything that doesn't. Now let's address something honestly. Many women struggle with this because they fear losing the connection. You think if I pull back, if I stop being available, he might leave. And that fear keeps you stuck in a position where you tolerate more than you should. But here's the truth. If setting boundaries causes him to leave, then he was only there because there were no boundaries in the first place. You didn't lose anything real. You just exposed something that wasn't solid to begin with. And that's hard to accept because emotionally you've invested. You've built something in your mind. You've attached meaning to the connection. And now the idea of losing it feels painful. But you have to ask yourself a real question. What are you actually holding on to? Is it consistent effort, respect, and mutual value? Or is it moments, potential, and hope? Because those are not the same thing. When you operate from a place of self-respect, you stop trying to secure someone's attention by overgiving. You start observing instead of chasing. You allow people to show you who they are without interference. And when a man knows that your presence in his life is not guaranteed, that's when he starts paying attention. That's when he becomes more intentional, more aware of how he shows up, more careful about how he treats you, not because you forced him, but because he understands the value of what he could lose. But let's be clear, this only works if your standards are real. You can't pretend to have boundaries and then break them the moment you miss him. You can't act like you're willing to walk away if you're not actually prepared to do it. People can feel that. They can sense when your actions don't match your words. And when that happens, your value drops because now you're seen as someone who doesn't stand on what they say. Consistency in your behavior is what builds respect. When you say, I don't accept this, and you actually mean it, that's when things shift. That's when your presence carries weight. That's when a man understands that being in your life is a privilege, not a guarantee. And here's something important. You're not doing this to control him. You're doing this to protect yourself. Because when you make yourself too accessible to someone who hasn't earned that level of access, you put yourself in a position where you're giving more than you're receiving. And over time, that imbalance leads to frustration, resentment, and emotional exhaustion. A healthy connection requires mutual effort. It requires both people to show up, to invest, to value each other. And if that's not happening, then no amount of your effort will fix it. You can't compensate for someone else's lack of intention. So instead of trying to be more, give more, or prove more, shift your focus. Start asking yourself, is he doing enough to keep me? Not from an ego perspective, but from a standard perspective. Is he consistent? Is he respectful? Is he intentional? Is he showing through his actions that he values your presence? If the answer is no, then the problem isn't that you need to do more. The problem is that you need to do less. and be willing to walk away, because at the end of the day, a man who truly values you doesn't need to be convinced. He doesn't need to be chased. He doesn't need constant reminders of your worth. He sees it, he respects it, and he acts accordingly. And if he doesn't, then your job is not to change his mind. Your job is to change your position. Because the moment you understand that your value increases when it's protected, not constantly given away, everything about how you move in relationships begins to change. Most people think communication is the key to respect. They believe if they just explain themselves better, say the right words, or express their feelings clearly enough, things will change. But let me tell you something real. Words don't build respect, behavior does. You can sit there and explain your boundaries all day long, but if your actions don't back them up, those words mean absolutely nothing. A man doesn't learn how to treat you by what you say. He learns by what you allow. You can tell him, I don't like inconsistency, but if you keep answering his late replies like nothing happened, what did you actually teach him? You taught him that inconsistency is acceptable. You can say, I deserve respect. But if you continue to entertain disrespectful behavior, your actions cancel out your words every single time. And people always follow actions over words because actions reveal the real standard. That's why boundaries are more powerful than conversations. Conversations can be emotional. They can be misunderstood. They can be ignored. But boundaries are clear. They are felt. They create consequences. And consequences are what drive change. Now understand this, setting a boundary is not just about saying no. It's about deciding what you will no longer tolerate and being prepared to act accordingly. That's the part most people skip. They say the boundary, but they don't enforce it. And the moment you fail to enforce it, you weaken your position. Because now the other person sees that your limits are flexible, that your standards can be negotiated, and that your words don't carry weight. And once that happens, it becomes very difficult to rebuild respect, because respect is built on consistency. It's built on knowing that when you say something, you mean it, that your behavior aligns with your standards, not your emotions. And that's where discipline comes in, because enforcing boundaries is not easy, especially when you're emotionally attached. It requires you to choose self-respect over temporary comfort. It requires you to walk away from situations that feel good in moments but are wrong in reality. Let's be honest, this is where most women struggle. You know what you should do, but your feelings pull you in the opposite direction. You miss him. You remember the good times. You start questioning yourself. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I should just talk to him. And in that moment, if you give in, you break your own boundary. And every time you break your own boundary, you send two messages, one to him and one to yourself. To him, you're saying, you can keep doing this and I'll still be here. To yourself, you're saying, my standards are not that important. Now think about that. How can you expect someone else to respect you if you're not even respecting your own limits? This is why boundaries are not about controlling someone else. They're about controlling your own behavior. You're not telling him what he has to do. You're deciding what you will do if your standards are not met. That's the difference. That's where your power is. Because you can't control how someone shows up, but you can control what you accept. And once you truly understand that, everything shifts. You stop trying to convince people to treat you better, and you start removing yourself from situations where they don't. You stop over-explaining, over-justifying, and over-giving. You become clear, direct, and intentional with your actions. And let me tell you something, clarity is attractive, not because it impresses people, but because it commands respect. When a woman knows her boundaries and stands on them without hesitation, it changes how she's perceived. She's no longer someone who can be tested repeatedly. She becomes someone whose presence carries weight. Now here's something important. Boundaries don't guarantee that someone will rise to meet them. Sometimes, when you enforce your standards, people will fall away. And that's where you have to be honest with yourself. Are you willing to lose someone who doesn't meet your standards? Or are you more comfortable keeping them and lowering your value? Because you can't have both. You can't demand respect and tolerate disrespect at the same time. And yes, it can feel lonely at first. It can feel like you're losing something. But what you're actually doing is creating space for better treatment, for healthier connections, for people who align with your standards. You're not losing, you're filtering. And that's a mindset shift you need to make. Because when you stop seeing boundaries as something that pushes people away and start seeing them as something that protects your value, you move differently. You stop negotiating your worth for attention. You stop settling for half-effort connections. You start requiring consistency, respect, and intention, not through words, but through what you tolerate. And let's bring this back to something simple. Every interaction you have is teaching someone how to treat you. Every time you accept less, you lower the standard. Every time you enforce a boundary, you raise it. So the question is not, does he understand how I feel? The real question is, what have I been allowing? Because that answer will tell you everything. At the end of the day, words can start a conversation, but boundaries define the outcome. And if you want to be respected, valued, and taken seriously, you have to move in a way that reflects that. Not just when it's easy, but especially when it's hard.